Alistair Vane was 11 minutes from the most important meeting of his life when a child grabbed his sleeve and screamed at him not to open the door. He had been moving through the atrium of the Vane Maritime building, the way he always moved through spaces, with the focused momentum of a man who considered stillness a form of failure. 52 years old, silver at the temples, a suit that had cost more than some people's monthly rent. Outside, Halifax Harbour sat grey and frozen under a January sky the colour of old pewter, and somewhere across the city the Bergen investors were already seated in a borrowed boardroom, waiting to sign an $88 million merger that would make Vane Maritime the largest privately held shipping company east of Montreal. Alistair had rehearsed the numbers until they felt like his own heartbeat. He did not need distractions. The girl came out of nowhere. She was maybe 11, maybe younger, hard to tell, because she had the kind of face that worry ages before its time. Dark hair braided tight against her head, though the braid had come half undone and was frizzing around her ears. Her coat was a man's winter jacket, olive green, belted at the waist with a piece of rope because the original zipper pull was long gone. Her boots, one had a strip of silver duct tape running along the sole where it had separated from the upper. She smelled of cold air and wood smoke and something indefinably like the harbour itself, brine and diesel and whatever survived out in the open when the temperature dropped to -15. She had both hands on his arm and she was not letting go. "Don't go through that door," she said. Her voice was breathless, shaking, but her eyes were clear, dark and absolutely certain. "The glass. I heard the guys talking on their radios. They found cracks in the panels this morning. Please, don't go through." She meant the executive walkway, the glass-enclosed bridge that connected the main tower to the boardroom, annexed 2 floors below the roof. Alistair used it every morning. 38 steps of glass and steel suspended over the building's internal atrium, 6 stories down to the marble lobby floor. It was the fast route to the annex. It was the only route if you were in a hurry. He looked at her. He looked at the door. He pulled his arm free. "Building security," he said, already turning back toward the door. "There's a child in the main atrium." He had his hand on the handle when it happened. Not a crash. More like a sound he had never heard before and hoped never to hear again. A deep, structural groan, and then a sequence of pops like something enormous clearing its throat. The walkway's east glass panel gave way in a single sheet. It didn't shatter so much as it disintegrated, a glittering cascade that fell 6 stories in silence before it hit the lobby floor and exploded into sound. The maintenance worker, who had been inspecting the frame from a suspended platform, threw himself against the wall. His toolbox went down with the glass. The entire atrium filled with a sound like a wave breaking on rock, and then nothing. Absolute nothing. The kind of silence that descends on a room full of people who have all understood at once how close something terrible just came. Alistair stood with his hand still on the door handle. The girl had not moved. She stood 3 feet behind him, her arms pulled to her chest, watching. When he turned to look at her, she wasn't triumphant. She just looked exhausted in a way that children should not look exhausted. "I tried," she said quietly, and he wasn't sure if she meant to him or to herself. His name was called from 3 directions at once. His assistant, the building security chief, someone from the safety office. He answered all of them and answered none of them properly, because part of him was still standing at that door with his hand on the handle, already on the other side of it in his mind, already 6 stories down. He cancelled his appearance at the Bergen meeting, sent his VP with full authority and a detailed brief. Bergen could wait 40 minutes. Bergen would have to. He bought the girl hot chocolate from the cart on the ground floor. The cart run by an older man named Gerald, who had been there so long he was practically structural, and he sat across from her at one of the lobby tables, while the safety officers cordoned off the walkway above them, and the lobby slowly refilled with sound. Her name was Celia. She told him this without being asked, as though she had learned early that giving adults the information they needed kept conversations moving. "How did you know?" he asked. "I was here yesterday," she said. "I come in sometimes to use the bathroom when it's cold. The security guard with the ponytail, she lets me. And the maintenance guys were right there talking, and they didn't see me because nobody sees me when I'm in here." She said it simply, without self-pity, as though invisibility were a weather condition. They said the east panel had a stress fracture from when the crane hit the building last autumn. They said it was going in their report. I don't think anybody read the report. Alistair looked at his hot chocolate for a moment. Where are your parents, Celia? A pause, brief but telling. Just my dad. He's at the pier. He does odd jobs when they'll have him. And where do you and your dad sleep? She looked at him carefully, the way children look at adults when they're deciding how honest to be. Then she seemed to decide he had earned something. There's a modified container at Pier 22, number 4 Bravo. Someone put in a floor and a space heater and a couple of camp cots. We've been there 7 weeks. 7 weeks, January in Halifax in a shipping container. Alistair thought of his apartment on the waterfront, the apartment with the heated floors and the espresso machine that cost $800, and the view of the McDonald Bridge that he never actually looked at because he was always on his phone. I'd like to meet your father, he said. Keith Broom was a tall man going grey, with the particular posture of someone who had spent 20 years around heavy machinery, straight-backed and careful, as though he'd long ago learned that slouching around a crane was how you lost fingers. He met Alistair at the pier with the controlled wariness of a man who had been surprised by bad news enough times that he now approached all news with the same measured stillness. He shook Alistair's hand. He did not ask for anything. It was only later, over dinner at a diner on Barrington Street, the four of them, Alistair, Celia, Keith, and Alistair's assistant Annette, who had arrived with a folder of notes and left the folder unopened, that the name surfaced. Broom, Keith Broom, former head foreman, Halifax Port Operations, Vane Maritime Group, 11 years of service. Let go in the restructuring of 2021, when Alistair had approved the automation of 40% of the warehouse floor and eliminated 19 foreman positions in a single HR memo, standard severance, clean, legal, entirely handled by people whose names Alistair could not currently recall. He sat very still when he understood. You worked for me, he said. Keith looked at him evenly. I did. For 11 years. 11 years, 4 months, a pause, not that I'm keeping score. Celia was eating soup and pretending not to listen in the way children pretend, which is to say, she was listening to every word. When the severance ran out, Keith said, and his voice was steady, the voice of a man who had rehearsed this story until the sharp edges wore down, I had the house for another 8 months. Then I didn't. My wife had passed the year before. Cancer. 2 years of treatment, which is what the savings went to. After the house, we moved around. Celia kept up with school as long as I could manage it. Since October, she's been doing workbook pages I pick up at Value Village. He glanced at his daughter. She's 2 grades ahead on math. Her teacher said so before. Well, before. Alistair looked at the girl who had saved his life that morning. She was working through her soup with methodical focus, but she had gone pink around the ears in the way children go pink when they're embarrassed by praise. Celia, he said carefully, your father, does he ever talk about what happened, about Vane Maritime? She looked up. He says it was just business, she said. He says it's not good to hold a grudge because it uses up energy you could spend on better things. The words landed with a weight that Alistair felt in his chest rather than his ears, his own language. The language of his industry, his world, his decisions, filtered through 11 years and an automated warehouse, and a modified shipping container, and a child who spent her winter mornings doing math workbooks from Value Village and had come out the other side as something close to forgiveness. He did not deserve forgiveness. He hadn't even known there was something to forgive. He paid for dinner. He said nothing about the merger. He drove home through streets that looked the same as they always had and felt entirely foreign. What followed was not a clean transformation. It never is. Clean transformations are the kind that get announced at press conferences and forgotten by February. What happened to Alistair Vane was slower and more uncomfortable, and it started with a single phone call to his facilities manager at 7 in the morning, asking about the unused 3rd floor of the Vane Maritime building. The 3rd floor had been storage for 17 years. Archived paper records, equipment no one used, 3-decade-old filing systems that had been superseded by software twice over. It was 3,000 square feet of wasted space in a building 2 blocks from the waterfront, where families were sleeping in modified containers. His CFO Annette thought he had lost his mind. She said so, in those exact words, standing in his office doorway on a Tuesday morning with a printout of the preliminary renovation costs in her hand. "This is not what we do," she said. "We move cargo. We negotiate freight contracts. We don't convert our records floor into," she glanced at the printout, "transitional family housing." "We do now," Alistair said. "Alistair, the board." "I'll handle the board." He didn't handle the board as cleanly as he'd hoped. Silas, who had been on the Vane Maritime Board for 14 years and had the institutional memory of someone who had weathered 3 downturns and 2 family disputes and considered himself the stabilizing force of the company, delivered his objections with the sorrowful patience of a man who had seen this before. CEOs who got religion, CEOs who got divorced, CEOs who had a brush with mortality and started making decisions with their emotions instead of their balance sheets. "The Bergen people are watching," Silas told him, in the particular tone of men who use watching as a synonym for disapproving. "A merger of this size requires consistent leadership optics. You disappear from a critical meeting, you convert the building's 3rd floor. There are photographs of you at the children's hospital at 2 in the morning. One of the kids near the pier got hypothermia," Alistair said. "His name is Rory. He's 8. The space heater in the building they were using failed during the cold snap. I brought him to IWK. He's fine." That's not the point. I think it might be exactly the point. It was Bram Harwick who made it ugly. Bram ran Harwick Maritime out of Dartmouth, smaller than Vane, aggressive in the way that companies are aggressive when they're trying to compensate for size, and hungry for a piece of the Nordic contract that the Bergen merger would lock down for a decade. He had been feeding information to a reporter at the Chronicle for weeks: the renovation costs, the board tensions, the photograph from IWK. The story that ran was careful enough to be technically accurate and dishonest enough to be damaging. A CEO acting erratically, a merger at risk, a company losing its direction. The Bergen investors called to reschedule, not cancel, reschedule, but the distinction felt thin. Alistair sat alone in his office at 11 at night, his phone full of messages he hadn't answered, the lights of Dartmouth reflected in the dark harbor below, and he was thinking about what Celia had said to him 3 weeks earlier when she'd come to find him, alone in this same office, after the other kids had settled in the temporary rooms on the 3rd floor. She'd knocked on the door properly, which struck him, because she was 11, and most 11-year-olds did not knock on doors. She'd sat in the chair across from his desk, with her hands in her lap. She was wearing a proper winter coat now, navy blue, with all its buttons, and she had looked at him carefully for a moment before speaking. "The kids are saying you're going to give up," she told him. "Because of the man in Dartmouth and the newspaper story. The older ones, anyway. The little ones don't know about it, but Rory figured something was wrong because you looked worried when you came to check on him yesterday." "I wasn't aware I looked worried." "You always look worried now," Celia said. She said it gently, as though worry were a coat he'd put on that she wasn't sure suited him. "But you also look more like a real person than you did before. My dad says that's what happens when you stop running away from things." He had thought about asking her what Keith meant by that. He had decided he already knew. He picked up his phone and started making calls. The first call was to a journalist he trusted, not the Chronicle, but a woman at the national desk who had covered Atlantic Canada infrastructure for 12 years and whose reputation was built on not flinching. He told her everything: the cracked glass panel, the shipping container, Keith Broom, the 3rd floor, the Bram Harwick campaign, all of it. She asked good questions. She asked them twice when his answers were incomplete. The second call was to his lawyer, who confirmed what Alistair had suspected. Bram Harwick's company had been systematically underbidding federal port contracts using numbers that could only be possible if they were falsifying their cost submissions. The lawyer had been building a file for 6 weeks, waiting for the right moment. The third call was to Silas, who answered on the second ring because men like Silas always answered their phones, regardless of the hour. "I'm not giving up the 3rd floor," Alistair said without preamble. "And I'm not stepping back from the Bergen deal. But I need you with me on this, and I need you to trust that I understand what I'm doing." A long pause on the line. harbor sounds distant through the office glass. "Your father would have done this in his 40s, Silas said finally. "Took you a little longer to get here." "Is that a yes?" "It's an observation," Silas said, "and yes." The story broke on a Thursday. The journalist's piece ran nationally, not just the Bergen merger or the housing initiative, but the full arc of it: the glass panel, the girl who'd warned him, Keith Broom's 11 years, and the automated memo that had ended them, Rory in the IWK, the children on the third floor learning to sleep in rooms with proper walls for the first time in months. It was the kind of story that people read on their phones over coffee, and then put their phones down and sat quietly for a moment. The Bergen investors called back the following Monday. The lead negotiator, a careful woman named Astrid, who had built her career on reading rooms correctly, said 3 things. First, that they were proceeding with the merger. Second, that they wanted to discuss Alastair's proposal, which he had not yet formally made, about incorporating a displaced worker transition fund into the contract terms. Third, that she had a daughter, also 11, who also asked questions that were too good for the adults around her. The Harwick Maritime contract investigation was announced 6 weeks later. Bram Harwick did not call. Alastair did not expect him to. What happened after was quieter than what came before, which is how recovery usually works. Not a single dramatic reversal, but a series of smaller corrections, each one easier than the last. Keith Broom started as a contract operations consultant in March, reviewing the efficiency gaps in the Bergen integration. The exact work his 11 years had prepared him for, the exact work the automation memo had told him he was no longer needed to do. He was precise, practical, and relentlessly decent. Within 4 months, 3 members of the Bergen team had specifically requested him on their planning calls. Celia enrolled at a school in the South End and tested 2 grades ahead in mathematics, exactly as her father had said. Her teacher, a woman with the patient eyes of someone who had been teaching long enough to know which children were waiting to be seen, called Keith in October to say that Celia had submitted an optional project on harbor tide patterns and cargo weight distribution the teacher had found genuinely interesting. She had used a topographic map of Bedford Basin that Celia had drawn herself, from memory and observation, while living near Pier 22 in the winter. The Vane Maritime third floor became a formal partnership with the Halifax Regional Municipality in the autumn. Transitional housing and employment navigation services for families in crisis, with a small classroom used 3 mornings a week by a volunteer literacy program. It was not large. It was not a solution to anything systemic. Alastair said as much at the opening, to the mild disappointment of the city councillors, who had come prepared for grand statements. "It's 1 building," he said. "It's 34 people right now. We're learning what works, and we're doing it carefully, and we're going to try to help other companies in the Harbour District do something similar. That's all I can honestly say." Celia, standing with her father near the back of the small crowd, turned to Keith and whispered something. He bent down to hear her and then smiled, a real smile, the kind that took over his whole face. Later, Alastair asked her what she'd said. "I said, that sounds like a real person talking," Celia told him, "not a press release." He laughed for the first time in longer than he could precisely remember. In November, on a Saturday, when the harbour was iron grey and the first proper snowfall of the season was coming down in thick, quiet curtains, the 3 of them ate dinner at a diner on Barrington Street, the same diner, the same corner table, because Celia had requested it, and neither Alastair nor Keith could think of a reason to say no. Keith had the fish chowder. Alastair had coffee and a club sandwich he barely touched because he was mostly listening. Celia had soup again, working through it with the same methodical focus as the first time. She had a drawing with her, folded into quarters in her coat pocket. She spread it out on the table after the dishes were cleared. A detailed pencil sketch of Halifax Harbour, rendered in the particular style she'd developed over months, precise and strange and somehow warmer than precision usually allowed. The cranes at the container terminal, the ferry crossing to Dartmouth, the McDonald Bridge drawn from below, its cables rising into a sky she'd cross-hatched into something that looked like movement, and on the docks, stick figures, tiny, careful, each one distinct in some small way, holding hands in a chain that ran the length of the waterfront. At the bottom, in her careful slanted printing, the water looks cold, but it always brings people home. Keith looked at it for a long time without speaking. Alistair asked if he could keep it. Celia considered the question seriously, the way she considered all questions. "You can have it," she said finally. "If you put it somewhere, you'll actually see it, not in a drawer." "I'll put it in my office," he said, "next to my father's compass." "Does the compass work?" It did. He used it on the boats when he was young. Celia looked satisfied. "Then they'll go together," she said. "Things that help you find where you are." Outside, the snow came down on the harbor and the docks, and the modified containers at Pier 22, which were empty now, the space heater long since removed, the camp cots gone. The water was cold, the way it always was in November, and the lights of Dartmouth blurred through the snowfall into something almost warm. Alistair sat in a corner booth in a diner on Barrington Street and listened to a man he had never properly known tell his daughter about the time he'd seen a humpback whale breach in the basin, just off the Armdale Rotary, back when Celia was 4 and didn't remember it. Celia said she wished she remembered. Keith said she'd been asleep, bundled up on his lap, and that she'd seen it in her own way. Alistair did not check his phone once. That was new, and it didn't feel like loss.